Regardless of who you're speaking to, the word abortion today is sure to draw up a very strong emotional response. The topic of reproductive care is now known as incredibly divisive, with strict political party lines typically being drawn between Republicans and Democrats on who does and does not support reproductive health care. But it hasn't always been this way. Republicans did not always run on such anti-reproductive health platforms, and Christian leaders and religious institutions, with the exception of the Catholic Church, did not rally behind these restrictive laws citing the life of the unborn. The Southern Baptist Convention, which, if you're not familiar, is comprised of thousands of Baptist churches across the United States, usually in the southern states. They were, back in the 70s, and still today, one of the most right-leaning, conservative religious organizations in the nation. But still, in 1971, the convention met in St. Louis and issued a resolution calling for the federal legalization of abortion, a position that they reaffirmed in 1974, 1 year after the Supreme Court's ruling of Roe v. Wade, and then again in 1976. When Roe was first ruled in 1973, W.A. Criswell, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas and occasional president of the Southern Baptist Convention, he issued a statement praising the Supreme Court's ruling, saying, "I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person, and it has always therefore seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed." End quote. James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, who later became a staunch anti-abortion advocate, acknowledged in 1973 that the Bible was silent on the matter, and therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe that a developing embryo or fetus was not to be regarded as a full human being. End quote. Very well-known preacher and televangelist Jerry Falwell, who we're going to come back to in a little bit, he did not preach his first anti-reproductive health sermon until 1978, which was 5 years after the Supreme Court's Roe ruling. And it wasn't just these Christian institutions that largely supported the legalization of reproductive health care throughout the 60s and early 70s. The majority of registered Republicans, according to the Journal of Policy History, again throughout the 60s and the 70s, were in support of the legalization of abortion rights, both in their states and federally. In fact, the chair of the Republican National Committee from 1974 to 1977, Mary Louise Smith, not that Mary Louise Smith, this Mary Louise Smith. Yeah, she was also the first chair of the Republican National Committee, but not this one. This one. But this one was a very well-known advocate and supporter of abortion rights, and she was the chair of the committee until 1977. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, what changed? If the federal legalization of abortion was not the catalyst that sparked the Republican leaders and the religious leaders' intense attack on reproductive health care, if that instead started a few years later, it was racial progress. Yep. We're in America. It always comes back to racism here. No, it was not in fact the 1973 Supreme Court ruling of Roe v. Wade that was met with mass political and religious backlash and sparked an entire resurgence of the Republican Party that would go on to refer to themselves as things like the new right and the moral majority. And despite what they were loudly advocating against at the time, the rallying point for all of these leaders was not the federal legalization of abortion, but was instead the defense of racial segregation in private schools that they disguised behind a return to conservative values. Let's briefly go through the timeline. In 1954, the Supreme Court rules that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, ruling in favor of Brown v. Board of Education. And how did white people react to that ruling? Well, what's known as segregationist academies thrived. These were private, usually Christian, institutions that only accepted white students. It was early, but it was also advanced education. These were academies such as Bob Jones University, which is still around today, which started as a whites-only Christian academy. And these schools were incredibly profitable. This means that a lot of the white preachers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s were making a lot of money operating these white-only Christian academies. At the same time that public education was being stripped as much as possible, these private academies were booming because white people, with the generational wealth and the ability to do so, were pouring all of their money into them. But the fight continued on, so we bump up a little bit further to 1976, this time from the mothers of 2 black students who were denied entry into these private Christian academies. This case was Runyon v. McGrary. The Supreme Court rules in their favor in 1976, saying that private schools also cannot legally exclude black children on the basis of their race. meaning these private, religious, but incredibly profitable schools that were previously not paying taxes were going to have to start if they did not start enrolling Black students. So here's where men like popular televangelist Jerry Falwell and Republican political strategist and co-founder of the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, this is where they come in to the reproductive health scene. The 76 Runyon v. McGrary ruling not only hurt these men's pockets, but it also signified a shift in the societal acceptance of racist policies and racist practice. But it was this case, not the 3-year previous ruling of Roe v. Wade, that prompted the resurgence of the Republican Party and sparked the creation of this new right. Paul Weyrich's goal, in the wake of a discouraged voter base post-Watergate scandal, which, side note, do you remember when we used to care about politicians and presidents lying to us? Good times. Anyway, Weyrich's goal was to rejuvenate support in his white Christian voter base and get them back out to the polls. I mean, his ultimate goal was to prevent the re-election of President Jimmy Carter, but we'll get to that in a second. But after the 76 Supreme Court case of Runyon v. McGrary, he begins to redirect his focus away from a more public support of these racist practices. What made Paul Weyrich more successful than some of these other political strategists who were again attempting to reinvigorate their voter base was his understanding that the defense of racial segregation, that racism, was not going to continue to be likely to energize these evangelical voters. So he, along with others whose pockets were affected by the 76 Supreme Court ruling, first attempted to flip the script against these anti-discriminatory laws. Instead of the religious right directly mobilizing in support of the tax-exempt status of these whites-only religious academies, evangelical leaders in the late 70s categorized these anti-discrimination laws as attacks on religious freedom. This is a ploy that is still used by modern Republicans to justify all sorts of discriminatory practices. Do you guys remember that case? I'm gonna put it right here. Among others. And in similar fashion as Republican leaders of today, Weyrich wanted to stir up feelings of moral outrage in his voter base. Feelings that would cause them to overlook the other things happening behind the scenes in favor of focusing on whatever morality issue was the flavor of the week. To overlook things like, in this case, the intentional exclusion of Black students and other students of color from these private Christian academies. But right then, religious freedom also did not prove to be the energizing issue that these religious and political leaders were looking for to stir up again support in their base. And so that is how abortion became one of the major issues championed by right-wing leaders and religious leaders. That is how the religious aspect ties into this, not because of anything that's actually said in the Bible. So in 1978, in an attempt to find something to invigorate a voting base, again, Paul Weyrich tries the anti-abortion route with 4 Senate races. He runs Senate candidates in New Hampshire, Iowa, and 2 in Minnesota, running on anti-reproductive health platforms in areas with historically low voter turnout and Democratic incumbents. And all 4 of his Republican candidates win their seats. And one of the major reasons why these campaigns were so successful was Paul Weyrich sends out canvassers to church parking lots within these districts with anti-reproductive health misinformation pamphlets. Just a bunch of lies to stir up moral outrage in Christian voters and get them to go vote for the Republican candidate. It didn't matter that these stances were not biblically supported. It did work because of the support and the preachings of these religious leaders who had a lot of money to lose in the 76 ruling and were fighting back against these anti-discriminatory laws so that they could continue to get money off of racist practices. So anyway, all these Senate races are lost to these Republican anti-choice candidates, and Paul Weyrich hears about it, and he is elated. In his writing, he characterizes the outcome as a true cause for celebration. After 2 years of attempting to find the morality issue, Weyrich and his allies had found it, the issue that would mobilize white evangelical voters: abortion. So at the same time, evangelists like Jerry Falwell and others with ties to these whites-only segregationist academies start preaching this anti-choice rhetoric. Weyrich takes his newfound knowledge from these Senate victories into the '81 presidential race and helps secure Reagan his first term, with Reagan running on anti-reproductive health rhetoric, despite, while he was governor of California, Ronald Reagan signing one of the most progressive abortion laws into the country. And in the years and the decades since Weyrich helped secure Reagan's victory, this drastic shift to such strong anti-abortion stances has never been more than a political tool to distract from the real goal, which in the 70s was the continuation of racist segregation in these highly profitable private schools. And with this diversion that is the topic of abortion successfully stirring up such strong feelings in their voter base, this new right were successfully able to conjure up a moral panic against legalized abortion and people who receive that healthcare. And this diversion also lent a successful disguise of respectability, if you will, to their real political activism, which is again racial exclusion and exploitation. Who cared that these pastors and politicians were actively lying to the American people, lying to their constituents, much to the dismay of doctors and reproductive health advocates everywhere? I mean, they certainly did not care. Because again, the goal has never been about life. It has always been a disguise to push for an ever-continual exploitable working class and a disguise for racism. Because while racism is such a problem still here in the United States, at a certain point they don't really care how much it affects other white people as well, and that's because of all of the profit to be made off of exploitation. I think about that interview from Lee Atwater, who was a Republican strategist who worked alongside Ronald Reagan, who talked about direct racism going out of fashion. He says in the 50s you can call black people whatever you want. By the 60s you have to be more abstract with it. You have to say things like states' rights. And how he talked eventually about the Republican Party being post-racial. Right? Because really since the civil rights era, since these black activists worked so hard for any sort of equitable footing in society, the elites have pulled back and class divide has become much more prevalent. And so while racism is still an incredibly important problem that cannot be overlooked even in interpersonal circumstances, the bad things that were prior to the 50s and 60s almost exclusively happening to black communities and other communities of color can now happen to poor white communities. Poor white folk are feeling it too. A lot of times we would rather bicker with other communities who have been in a worse boat than we have for much longer about small differences than recognizing the similarities that we share, which is that a lot of our circumstances are manufactured and based off of, again, exploitation from this elite and ruling class. You've probably heard activists for any number of causes say that oppression is interconnected, that we are all linked, but it can be hard to pull back and look at the bigger picture and think about what that really means. In this case, to acknowledge how women's reproductive rights have simply been used as a tool to distract from power grabs by the elites and a push for a return to a more discriminatory and exploitative society than we are even currently living in now. It's also worth mentioning that Paul Weyrich was a huge supporter of voter suppression, saying in 1980, prior to Ronald Reagan's first win, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people, and they never have been from the beginning of our country. And they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down." End quote. So when groups of people are attempting to convince the American populace that they would like to make America great again, this is what they mean. A time when only white men were voting because only white men could vote, because they were excluding everybody else. And that is part of the reason why so many white evangelicals today will still buy into these lies, because some of them are even old enough to remember a time when they too were benefiting from racial exclusion. But it's important to note that society does not have to be structured that way for people to still live happy and healthy lives. And a more equitable society and the acknowledgement of privilege does not automatically mean that as white people your life is going to get worse. I also think it's important to note before I close that Weyrich also went on record saying that his strategy of garnering support at a local level, electing those supporters, and then working upward was inspired by his observation of progressive and civil rights organizers. So, do with that information what you will. But this is a very brief history of why I call the modern day pro-life movement a great lie. Even from its origins, it has always been about ensuring the highest quality of life for a very select and white few. So please don't let yourself be a pawn for the ruling class who would also sell you and your rights away in a second if they needed a new distraction to rile up support in their base. And please, make no mistake, the only reason why religious leaders and conservatives are coming so hard for drag queens and other members of the queer community right now is because they've done it. With the exception of a federal ban, which they are coming for, they have won the abortion fight. They've overturned Roe v. Wade, but it will never end there because it was never about protecting life. It has always been about having a scapegoat for the rage of the white American evangelical voter to encourage them to continually vote against their own best interests. Abortion is healthcare, and Republican and religious leaders have lied to people for about 50 years because there has been huge financial incentive for them to do so. It is important to note that the Supreme Court ruling of Roe v. Wade is what made abortion federally legal. Please let me know in the comments if you would like a part 2 talking about how when men came into the reproductive health care scene around the time of the Civil War and how we started to see restrictive laws on abortion popping out throughout this country. Spoiler alert, it's also because of racism.